Welcome back, everyone, to Progressively Incorrect, a really fun show. And I'm really happy everybody is here today because I am interviewing Daisy Christodoulou, who is one of my heroes in the world of assessment and technology and the world of knowledge and critical thinking. I'm also going to mention right now our sponsor, which is John Catt Educational, which publishes some of the best books in education, including my new book, Just Tell Them: The Power of Explanations and Explicit Teaching. Some people have gotten in contact with me and asked, how do I get a copy if it's out on Amazon? Because yes, there were some shortages there. Lots of different options online, but you can definitely just contact John Catt and they can give you bulk discounts on this book and other books in their catalog. Thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in. Daisy, how are you doing? Welcome to the show.
Yes, brilliant. Thanks for having me. Very much looking forward to it.
Well, this is going to be fun because we get to talk about everyone's favorite topic, I guess, which would be assessment towards the bulk of the end of this show. But I did want to start off talking about your newest book, which you ventured out of education a little bit on this latest book. I Can't Stop Thinking About VAR. And one of the things you may not have known is that you were actually one of the first people on a podcast to introduce me to the idea of using examples a little more systematically, maybe leading with examples. Could you explain to us in this American audience who do not know what VAR is, what VAR is, perhaps using some examples?
For sure, yeah. So VAR stands for video assistant referee. So when the on-field referee makes a decision in a soccer match, the video assistant referee can kind of take a look at it, overturn it. It's kind of a system for reviewing referees' decisions. And you might be thinking, why are we talking about this podcast about education? My day job is in education. I work for an assessment organisation, and I've written books about education. And I got interested in this VAR issue because there are a lot of similarities with assessment. So I'm kind of looking at sports decision review systems, almost kind of from the lens of like measurement theory or assessment theory, and kind of seeing what the two have to say to each other. So it might seem like a bit of a leap and a bit different, but yeah, that's where it all came from.
For us, when we think about like video review systems, I think the only thing people complain about mostly is that it makes the game longer. Like it takes longer to get to a decision. We all saw it on TV and we're like, why did we see it first? And now we have to like wait a second for them to like huddle around a screen. I mean, are there problems beyond then just an efficiency piece? Is there actually a measurement element to it?
Yes. So the time issue that you talk about, the efficiency is a big one. So some of the decisions in football, I think the longest one has been 5 or 6 minutes. And actually, in a 90-minute game, if you're pausing it to review a decision and that takes 5 or 6 minutes, that is quite significant. And soccer, unlike American football and other sports, it doesn't have natural breaks in play. So actually interrupting it like that is more of a big deal. So that's definitely one issue. And I have a chapter about that called The Flow of the Game, where I talk about that. But there are other big issues too. So there are big issues around handball and offside, which are two quite fundamental rules of the game. And there's kind of a concern that actually all the technology is not getting us to the right decision. And there's almost like a sort of bigger philosophical issue in that the more you are scrutinizing the game with slow motion replays, the scrutiny isn't necessarily getting you more clarity. The scrutiny is arguably just leading to more confusion. So you have people who will scrutinize a picture, a video clip of a player, the ball hitting his hand, and you think, oh, if I have a slow motion replay, I will work out. We have to really work out if it's hit his hand or not. And actually, you play it back sort of 10, 12 times, and you're like, oh, I'm not really sure. So there's all these kind of big issues.
I'm totally fine with us like spending the rest of the episode talking about this and not even talking about
Yeah,
education.
yeah,
But
yeah,
what are the parallels between I
yeah.
guess that you would see between
Yeah.
this and assessment and education?
Absolutely. So the thing that got me interested in it originally is in education, in assessment, a lot of assessment systems they're very heavily dependent on mark schemes or rubrics. So a mark scheme or a rubric is a prose statement, a kind of description of the standard that a student or a piece of work should reach. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with those, right? We've all got examples of those. Again, give an example. You've got an example of those in your head, those kind of lists of statements. They can be reframed in pupil-friendly language. I was looking only the other day at I can statements. So we see these in jurisdictions all around the world. The problem with these systems is they're not very accurate. They're not nearly as accurate as you think. So they look very objective. They look very precise. And you think to yourself, oh, if I take a pupil's work and I tick it off against all of these statements, that's a level of precision and objectivity. In actual fact, teachers who use those kind of mark schemes and rubrics to mark, they often won't agree. They'll use the mark scheme, but they won't agree on the mark that a piece of work should receive. And even almost worse than that, actually, if you ask a teacher to mark a piece of writing with that mark scheme one week and you come back and ask them again another week, they may not even themselves give it the same mark. So it's not even just that people are disagreeing with other people, it's that people disagree with themselves. And the thing that got me interested in this in soccer was you have exactly the same issue happening with the handball law. So what has happened is since these video replays have come along, people have realised. So the old handball rule in football was very short. It was just a deliberate handball is outlawed. Since VAR's come along, you've had all this video scrutiny. The handball rule has been rewritten again and again and again in order to try and provide more clarity. It's now 11 times as long as it was, and you haven't got that clarity. You've got a lot of confusion. So it's very similar to mark schemes. People rewrite them and try to make them more precise and add in layers and add in detail, and they think that will get agreement and objectivity. And actually, what it gives you is confusion and often actually more subjectivity. So, as I say, there's a little bit of a paradox here. So the situation in soccer and the situation with marking students' writing is very similar. And that's where my day job comes in. So I work for an organisation called No More Marking, and we provide online comparative judgment assessments. And comparative judgment is kind of a way out of this problem of trying to assess things like handball or children's writing consistently, right? So comparative judgment does away with the mark scheme. And what you do instead with comparative judgment, if you want to use it for students' writing, is you upload students' writing into our system. And instead of looking at one piece of writing at a time and looking at the mark scheme and looking at the piece of writing and going back and forth between the mark scheme and the writing, instead of that, you have two pieces of writing next to each other on screen. And you read them both and you say to yourself, which is the better piece of writing? And you don't need a mark scheme. You just make a holistic decision about what you think is the better piece of writing. And you don't just make one decision like that, you make a series of decisions like that. And it isn't just you making the decisions, your colleagues will join in. And in the big national and international projects that we run, we will have thousands of teachers making tens of thousands of judgments. And then the comparative judgment algorithm combines all of those decisions together to come up with a measurement scale for every piece of writing. And you would think that this approach, because it is reliant on essentially an individual holistic judgments, you would think that it would be pretty subjective, much more subjective than the approach of marking with a mark scheme. But actually, that's not the case. When you look at the data that comes back from it, even though the teachers are allowed to judge on whatever criteria they want, they actually have very high degrees of agreement with each other, much higher degrees of agreement than when they are using these apparently very objective rubrics. So as I say, that's the kind of the paradox here with comparative judgment, that something apparently subjective delivers quite objective results, whereas rubrics, mark schemes, things like very lengthy rules about handball, these feel very objective and precise, but they're not. They actually deliver quite subjective outcomes. So yeah, that's how the two relate, and that's how I got into it. And that's your brief explainer of comparative judgment.
Well, I think about our obsession, our national obsession here with teacher evaluations, with judging teachers, and how a lot of us use it like a Danielson rubric or one that's derived from the Danielson rubric. In the first instance, a lot of people that are in the space of explicit and direct instruction immediately recognize I'll never get the highest rating on this because it wants all the kids to teach each other on the most distinguished. But setting all that aside, you end up taking these tools and trying to judge teachers, either their bonus, their wages, or their experience level, or whatever. You use this tool, and according to the folks who know this better than me, it's not highly accurate. And so, like, where does the people in the United States who believe in this stuff or who want something to they don't want to get rid of it. They don't know what to do with that space if we got rid of it, or what to do in with they it feels great to be able to take a scientific approach to this, to accountability or whatever. What are your thoughts on sort of judging teachers, evaluating teachers, giving them a rubric and putting them on the scale of some sort?
Yeah, so I think you can broaden this out and talk about it all white collar professionals. How do you make judgments and hold them accountable? And I'm not going to pretend there's an easy answer. It's tricky. And in actual fact, I've worked with a few groups who have looked to use comparative judgment to evaluate teachers. And it's not straightforward. The assessment and evaluation and accountability systems for white collar professionals are actually notoriously really difficult. And you'll read case studies in business journals about a company who have cracked it. And then that company will, you'll look it up and it's, oh, well, they turned out they went bust 2 years later. So these things are not easy. And, they're rife also with kind of unintended consequences. I don't know very much about the robot you talked about. I think I know a little bit. I've seen it and other people have said it to me. So I don't want to pretend to be an expert on it. But I think, one issue is, as you've said, actually there's probably an inherent anti-direct instruction bias in it. And that is massively problematic, right? But I think the other issue is, even if you rewrote it to get rid of that, I still don't think that's an optimal way of evaluating teachers. If we were in a student assessment world, I'd say, look, you need to use something like comparative judgment, or you need to be using something. With student assessment, is there some other form of data you can use? Test scores. So for teachers, evaluating teachers, can you use the test scores of their students? This is also tricky too. I'm not averse to it, but you obviously you don't just want to measure attainment, you want to measure progress. Measuring progress technically can become quite challenging. I know there are examples in the USA where there was a kind of a bit of a rogue algorithm where a high profile example where people didn't really understand the algorithm. It turned out there was an error in it, and you were getting teachers who were having pay rises denied or put through on the basis of actually what was a faulty process. I don't want to pretend these issues are easy, and as I say, they're not unique either to teaching. I do think the rubric you talk about and rubrics in general have problems. They have flaws. And it's not enough to say, well, there's no other way of doing things. We just have to stick with this. We have to try and make better decisions and come up with better ways of doing things if we're seeing kind of obvious flaws. In the UK, schools have really moved away now from particularly the sort of the one lesson observation. And I think that's been a good thing. It was very popular when I was teaching. I do think there does have to be some element of test scores in it, in the mix. I am also aware of all the issues with that. As I say, not just the US one, but all the kind of very subtle issues that the composition of the group can have on the value add for a teacher. So, these things are tricky. I'm not anti-accountability. I think it is important that teachers are accountable, but there's some really shoddy ways of doing this.
Well, it's like a little bit like you're not, I bet you're not anti-accuracy in football, right? But it's like
Yeah,
some of the
yeah,
there's a
yeah,
problem with the
yeah,
it's not accurate. Where you put them
yeah,
on the rubric
yeah,
is like a flip of
yeah,
a coin. So we can't
yeah,
trust that this process when it comes
yeah.
to evaluating teachers.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I would point out, as I say, in the sort of broader issue of, white collar professional jobs, as I say, this is an issue. And it probably is an issue which ultimately, data on its own is not going to solve. And ultimately, it isn't an issue. It's a reason why we have managers and why there are managers and why there is still a role for, managerial and professional judgment. And I get that's not great either because I know all the issues with human bias and when you have human judgment and that bias. And so that's why I would say, you've got to be looking at not just accountability at the teacher level, but some form of accountability at the school and group level. In England, I would say one thing that has worked well, a reform that's worked really well in the last sort of 10, 15 years, is I think the metric we use for accountability at the school level is very effective. It's called Progress 8, and it measures progress of those students from the kind of start of the time they start secondary school at age 11 to when they leave at age 16. And I think it works very well. There are big technical issues with applying that to an individual class teacher. But at the school level, it does work very well. That's something that's really of value. So I guess what you've got for me, it's got to be, we need a school to be getting a good progress 8, and then the school management kind of armed with that and using that data and looking at the teachers within it, they've got to be using that to make judgments on the teachers they've got and how they can improve. So yeah, you've got to use better forms of data, and I think Progress 8 is a good one at the school level. Something like that at the school level. There are issues with applying those at the class level.
I I feel like it's like election season every time Progress 8 comes out on Twitter. Like Progress 8 comes out and all of a sudden Catherine Burble sings posting videos and there's all this crazy like and people are talking
Yeah,
about the biases within Progress 8, right? Maybe there's
yeah,
schools disadvantaged in terms of English language learners or something like
yeah,
that. Are
yeah.
there You said in general it's been good and it seems good. Do you see any areas for it to improve or some of the ways that it does bias results for certain types of schools or certain contexts?
So I think what you've got to remember in England, what did it replace? So when I started teaching, we had the predecessor to Progress 8, and that was a metric which said how many students, what proportion of students in your school are getting 5A star to C on the school leaving exam, which is the GCSE at age 16. That was a kind of, and that first of all, what were the issues with that? First of all, it was an attainment and achievement threshold target. So obviously, if you're getting a cohort of students who are starting really behind, it's going to be much harder for you to get them over that threshold. Whereas if you're in a school where you get a cohort all starting, really ahead, they will probably meet that threshold, or they could probably meet in their first year at school. So you could be a terrible school and get 100% on that. So that was the problem. That was one problem. The other problem with that, it was a threshold measure. So it was measuring the number of students. So the grade system then went A star, A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. And so it was measuring the percentage of students who got C and above. So you get a D, nothing. You get a C, you're in. So what you've got to think about then, the other thing you've got to think about with all of these kind of metrics is not just what they do when they start, but what do they incentivize? And what this system is incentivized, and this happened when I walked into teaching, this was what everybody was doing, and it was kind of seen as best practice, is it incentivized having really intensive revision groups for students on that DC boundary. Because the way that a school could improve their performance on these league tables, on this metric, was essentially to get kids over the DC boundary. And this had become a huge problem because the kids who were sort of FGs and the kids who were A's A stars were getting neglected. So the other good thing about Progress 8, so Progress 8 does a couple of good things. First, it is progress, not attainment. That's huge. And second, it reorients it away from this threshold measure. So if you, in the system, the grades have changed now as well from 1 to 9, but essentially you will now be rewarded for getting a student from the very bottom grade to the next to bottom, and you'll be rewarded for getting them from the second from the top to the top. So you'll be rewarded for any progress you make across the spectrum, which feels fairer. And also, crucially, feels like it's incentivizing the right thing, like it's incentivizing you to care about every student. So it's been around for a few years now. So I think we've had time to see if there are, really big, sort of bad unintended consequences. And look, no one metric is perfect. And I think there'll always be, if you like, sort of, bad actors who want to try and game it in the most cynical way possible. But I think this one is working. I think I would definitely say it's working better than the one we had before. And I'll be honest, the other thing about a metric, you sort of look at the schools that are doing well on it. They do seem like good schools who are trying to do the right thing. And what's also really good is, unlike the previous one, they're not all just concentrated in wealthy areas with well-off, parents who knows are paying for lots of tuition. It does feel like they're actually rewarding what's happening in the school, not just the sort of demographics or whatever. So yeah, I would say Progress 8 has been an improvement. And it's yes, it's I generally say if you're in a country and you're looking at what you could do, it's worth taking a look at.
Well, what's that idea? We call those the bubble kids that you mentioned earlier, the DC kids, where every teachers are doing this right now. They sit together, their principal comes in and says, "Okay, who are my bubble kids? Who are my kids who are just on the
Yeah,
cusp? Let's focus on
yeah.
them. Let's give them extra instruction."
And and actually, I want to expand on this because, as I say, I write about this actually at length in my book about VAR, and I wrote about it at length in my book on assessment because there's actually a really deeper, more important point about what you've said there. Because when I first sort of started saying, look, this is a problem, these bubble kids, as you call them, or DC kids, what a lot of people would say to me is they would say, no, you don't understand. Like, actually, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. Like, getting a kid over that threshold is really important. It's really important for them because the difference between the D and the C, it's like this qualitative difference where a D grade is like you can't read and a C grade is you're fully literate. And they maybe wouldn't say it in those extreme terms, but there is a real belief among people that moving a kid over that line is a big deal, and that therefore actually it is the right thing to be focusing on those kids and not the other kids. Now, from an assessment free point of view, this is just wrong. So, and this is a really crucial point, which is that the lines that are drawn, the grade lines that are drawn, the DCs, whatever, these are essentially pretty arbitrary, and they do not correspond to anything kind of in reality. So what I mean by that, students do not come neatly pre-packaged in grade boundaries. When you look at the underlying continuum of achievement, in any country for which we have data, in anywhere we look, any subject, it is continuous. Yeah, it is like a smooth gradation from not doing very well to doing really well. It's not these kind of neat graded categories. And one of my favorite writers on assessment, Daniel Koretz, he also spends a lot of time talking about this. And the fact that everybody spends a lot of time talking about this should tell you it's kind of really important. And he says in the US, the big problem as well is that these categories, which are just, as I say, arbitrary, they get given labels that have meaning in everyday life. And in the US, the really common labels are like proficient, developing, beginning. So if you say, and it will get reported in the newspapers as, oh, the number of kids that are proficient has dipped from 58 to 54%, or it's gone up from this to this. And, what does that proficient even mean? So in statistical terms, the difference between a kid who is one side of the proficient line and the kid the other side, the measurement error, they are within the measurement error of each other. Like the reality might be they're the other way around. And pushing a kid over that boundary and often using, tricksy exam technique style things to get them over the boundary. This is not changing their qualitative performance in any way. So you are not moving them from, oh my God, this side of the line, they were like destined for a completely hopeless life. And now we've moved them over that line, they're into the sunlit uplands. That is not the reality. The reality is it's a mark. It may even be the margin of error. It is a tiny, tiny difference. And I have a slide which I put up to illustrate this in England. I do it using the English grade set. And we have a grade set for our primary school, our elementary school children, which has just 3 grades. Now, the worst grades of all, ones with 3. So if you have to do a grade system, at least do 9. Like at age 16, we have a 9-grade system. 3-grade systems are the worst. And I will send you this slide and you can put it in your show notes because it's the most popular slide I've ever done. And every time I put it up in a training session, everybody takes photos of it. And basically, it shows like a normal distribution that has been split. It's got 2 lines in it, so it's split into 3. And what I show on it is I plot the scores of 4 children on this distribution. They're called John, Paul, George, and Ringo. John and Paul are kind of either side of the first 2 grades, like the bottom grade and the middle grade. And then George and Ringo are either side of the middle grade and the top grade. And so the point is that middle grade in particular, if you have a 3-grade system, the middle grade is enormous. The middle grade will represent kids from about the 15th percentile, potentially up to like the 85th. So that is enormous. So a kid who is right at the bottom of your middle grade and a kid who is right at the top of your middle grade are just completely different. Whereas 2 kids who are just either side of the line of middle and top or bottom and middle have way more in common with each other than kids who are at either end of the middle grade. So I realize sort of saying that in words is a bit clunky. And if we can, if you've got some show notes or whatever, you can put this image or this picture with them. But I know in the UK, when people see this, it really resonates. And again, in the US, I think with the issue around proficiency, but beginning, developing, all of that, you've got the same issue. And this is just a really bad way of doing assessment. And it causes so many distortions. And it's one of these things where there's a kind of abstract assessment theory point that is genuinely having massive real world implications. And, I'll just give you one sort of really simple real world implication that when you have this 3-part system, there's a kid can be right at the bottom of that. And they're being told, if that middle grade is the middle, they're being told all the time, oh, you're doing okay, you're average, you're in the middle. And they believe that and their parents believe that. And then suddenly when something happens that actually reveals they are really struggling and actually are in like the bottom quintile potentially. Suddenly everyone goes, what? You've told me all along I was doing okay. I was in the middle. I was at the expected standard. These are big issues. What do you do instead? My preference is for things like scaled scores, which I know obviously in the US you do have for things like the SAT, what have you, because they represent that continuum a bit more smoothly. It's also why I like things like reading ages and a writing age, which we've developed, because age is a great analogy because age is an analogy that we all understand it's continuous. We recognize that because it's continuous, they're still old and young, but we recognize that a month or 2 difference in age is not gigantic. And we also recognize that, when you turn 18, you get 1 day older. It's a nice landmark, but you don't magically overnight become tremendously more responsible. It's just another day. So I think people understand that age is continuous in a way that they find it quite difficult to understand that student attainment is like that too. So that's why I quite like representing attainment as age. And I know some people say, well, there's issues, what if you've got a 16-year-old, they're being told they've got a writing age of or reading age of a 9-year-old. I get all that. I understand that. No way of doing anything is perfect. There's all trade-offs. But I think the big thing we have to get across is that attainment is continuous. And when we don't realize that, it causes lots and lots of genuine real world issues that I have genuinely seen impact kids and parents. So that's the big thing for me on assessment.
Well, and we have this teacher assigned grading system that is that that is sort of cultural here, that is really difficult, I think, probably to ever get rid of. Like if you ever talk to Dylan William about his first impressions with Americans, like teacher assigned grades A, B, C, D, like for every assignment, every test, and it includes participation and behavior and all sorts of things are mixed into it. He'll tell you, like, you'll never get rid of it, and it's just crazy from him, from coming from abroad and seeing our system there. I guess, like, you can't solve all of this, but our teachers who here are under the impression that they're evaluating all these assignments off of a 4-point scale, start with proficient and meeting and not needs improvement and so on. Are they capable of being accurate with all of these different assignments in a way that actually says something important about the student's achievement? That's sort of the big question a lot of people have.
And it's a very good question. And I guess it depends, like, what is it? So again, a big fundamental principle in assessment is no assessment on its own is by itself valid or not valid. What matters is the inferences that you're trying to make. So what are you using? Basically, what that means, what are you using the assessment for? And the same assessment can be brilliant for one purpose and terrible for another. So a really good example, if you've got a kid who sits a maths exam in a foreign language and they do badly on it, does that mean they're bad at maths? Well, not necessarily. Does it mean they probably couldn't start an advanced maths course in a country where that's the first language? Probably yes, it does. Right? So what's your purpose? So when you're saying to me, the system you've got, is it fit for purpose? I guess my question is, like, what is the purpose? Where I think those kind of teacher evaluation systems are not fit, the purposes they're not fit for, is I really think the minute you're trying to use them for anything, any kind of judgment that's used kind of beyond that school. So when they're used for any kind of entry into the next stage of education, that's where I get really uneasy. And I know that kind of is how it works in the USA, but I think you do also have the SAT. And I think because that is nationally standardized, that takes some of the edge off of the other parts of the system, which have more of a teacher input. And that's why when I hear stories about lots of places in the US actually trying to get rid of the SAT, I think, you need, for something where you are trying to come up with a shared meaning, where you are trying to come up with a statement that holds true for students who have come from all kinds of different contexts, all kinds of different backgrounds, you need something that does impose some kind of shared meaning on that. And teacher judgments are not going to do that. Well, they might be good for lots of other things, but they're not going to do that. So, what are they good for? I will always say that teacher assessment, in terms of helping students to understand the next steps and what they need to do next, it's very good for that. And that's what I think teachers and systems should prioritize. Because the one thing you can't outsource, and you can't have almost a national system kind of telling you, is that teacher who knows the student and can understand what it is most important they need to work on next, and to check they have worked on it and they have understood it, and to iron out those issues. That's, for me, the really, really valuable bit that a teacher can do that's much harder for anyone else to do. And in my book, Making Good Progress, I talk about this, for me, as being the real difference between formative and summative assessment. And I borrow a distinction from Dylan William and Paul Black, a paper they wrote called Meanings and Consequences. And they talk about shared meanings and next steps. And they say the point of summative assessment is to give you a shared meaning. And if you want a shared meaning, if you want something that is consistent across different contexts, you have to have some kind of standardized assessment with standardized conditions and a way of standardizing the results from it. But if you want the next steps, what is it most useful for a student to focus on next? That is something where there's not the same pressure for it to be standardized, where there is more room for flexibility, and there's much more important to have a role for the teacher. So that would be my distinction. I think a lot of the ways in which we use teacher assessment within for that shared meaning purpose is really flawed. Having said that, there are ways you can use teacher assessment to come up with something that is a bit more robust and standardized. And actually, that is what comparative judgment does. So comparative judgment combines hundreds of thousands of teacher assessments from thousands of teachers and combines them together to give you something that is standardized. So, there are ways you can use teacher assessment. You just have to think about how you do it. The way that it's done in a lot of US and UK schools, it's not giving you anything that is of meaning beyond that school's context.
One of the big criticisms, going back to Progress 8, right, which for people who are listening here who are sticking around because they know all this very nerdy stuff about the UK context, is that you start by testing students on a series of tests in year 6. Is that right? Is that what's the first year of that? Yeah, and then it goes to year 10, or what is the?
So how Progress 8 works? So basically, broadly speaking, in England, kids do primary school, what you call elementary school, from ages 5 to 11. And then most of them will switch school at age 11 and go to a secondary school. And most secondary schools are 11 to 16, and a lot now go up to 18. And the big assessment points are at the end of each phase. So there's a big national assessment at age 11 that nearly everybody does in reading and maths. And there's another big one at 16 where you take that's where the Progress 8 comes in, and you can take a range of subjects there, but you have to do English, math, science. So there's these two big points at the end of each kind of phase, 11 and 16. And Progress 8 is measuring between 11 and 16. So it's effectively saying, like, roughly where was this kid amongst all the other kids at age 11? And then roughly where have they come out at age 16? And basically, have they done better than you would expect given where they started? So it is a bit technical. The government do publish all the sort of technical appendices of it. But as I say, we've had it for a few years now, and it does, it sort of comes out in the wash. It does seem to work.
And so one of the criticisms of some of the main high performing school on the list was that they may have gamed it in that they narrowed the scores around like nine tests basically. Is that for us to hear nine, at least for me to hear that the students took a series of 9 tests, that sounds extremely broad. Extremely
look,
broad.
let me talk you through it. People want the detail again. And so when I started teaching, basically then the way to game it was just to cut the kids down to do 5. Now, actually, historically in the UK, the tendency, even before the 5A starter C, the sort of tendency was that you would do about 8 subjects at age 16. So that's kind of a historic norm in the UK. The historic norm is you'll do 8 subjects, about 8 or 9, maybe 8 to 10 at GCSE. And then you cut down at age 16, you cut down to do 3 at A level. So we specialise very early in the UK, right? But typically you would take 8 or 9 at age 16. So at my school, like the standard was to do 9. I can still tell you my 9. Like most people have done, they'll tell you their GCSEs. They'll be in their 40s or 50s. They'll tell you what they did. The secondary school I went to, you basically like had to do 9, and then there was an option you could do a 10th. And then what happened is you had this 5A starter C measure that came in, and that came in, I can't quite remember, maybe late 90s or whatever. And the problem then was people did start gaming it by just doing 5. And that hadn't been the intention. That was one of your classic issues, that, it hadn't been the intention that everyone would do 5. It was just meant to say, oh, we'll look at your best 5, or you've got to get 5. And then people just, began gaming it by just doing the 5. So actually Progress 8, people might be saying now, oh, it's narrowing the curriculum. Progress 8 broadened things from where it was, okay? Because what was happening before Progress 8 is everybody was dropping down to 5. So Progress 8 is taking the students' progress in their best eight subjects. You can do more than 8. And actually, if you do more than 8, there is kind of, potentially a value to it, because it will take your best 8. So if you do 12, it will pick your best 8. There probably is some truth that some schools, I don't know, maybe they optimize by just doing 8, but 8 is quite a lot still. I don't think even, historically in England, anyone would have said, oh, 8 subjects isn't enough. I think if you're doing well, this is why I like Progress 8. I'm not saying it's impossible to game, but it's really quite hard to game it in a really obvious kind of blatant way, because it has been quite well designed. So if to do well on it, the best metric is one where if you try and game it, actually you end up with something everyone wants. And actually it feels to me that, potentially the way to game it is to get kids to do well and make progress on 8 subjects. gaming is really interesting. I've mentioned throughout this, I've referred to his work a couple of times. Daniel Koretz, he's professor of educational assessment at Harvard. He's written a fantastic book on assessment called Measuring Up. And he has a whole section on this issue about arbitrary lines and distributions. He has a whole section on the proficiency issue. He has a whole section on tests being valid or not valid. And he also has a section on kind of the gaming of metrics, which happens in all kind of walks of life. There's a British economist who has a line, it's called Goodhart's Law, and he says the minute that a measure becomes a target, it loses all value as a measure. So the minute people start trying to hit that measure, actually it starts to lose value. And I think there is some truth to that, but I think there is also you can still have better or worse designed metrics, right? And I think what we had with 5A Star to C was a very badly designed metric, and what we have with Progress 8 is a much better designed metric. So no, I'm not going to say that nobody's gaming it, nobody's trying to sort of cheat in any way. What I'm going to say is it is something that is designed well enough such that probably the easiest way to do well on it is to do the kind of things we want to see. And of course, it's not perfect. No one metric's perfect, but it's certainly better than what it replaced.
Because we're in a world here where we're pretty much just narrowing around two subjects, right? If you get
Yeah,
to by the time you get to high school, if you're really struggling and the school actually cares about your math and reading,
mm,
achievement,
mm,
they will start cutting out subjects and they'll start having you double up around two subjects. So that for me, the eight test just
yeah,
sounds, or the nine test just sounds
mm,
like a crazy, really like a broad
mm,
and well
yeah,
balanced
yeah,
education. So, thank you for bringing that up.
mm,
I do have a few questions that come up in sort of the debates around explicit and implicit sort of
mm,
inquiry-based instruction, and that relate to assessment. Teachers will design a rubric for group work, for example, or for inquiry skills, for projects, and they'll create like some criteria like shares or contributes or whatever, really sort of vague kind of
mm,
group work type of skills, and then they'll kind of go around the room as everyone's doing discovery learning, and they'll just start marking kids and creating a way of grading or measuring these generic skills. I have not met a single person, even principals in America, who don't think that that is like really cool, innovative best practice for teaching. And I just kind of wanted to get your whole thought on that kind of way of designing instruction and measuring sort of skills.
yeah, it's a massive problem. My breakdown is the summative is all about shared meanings, and the formative is all about next steps. And then you have to say what I think happened in past few decades in England as well is people said, well, I can have one test that does both of those things. I can have one test that I can use to give the students formative feedback, and I can use it to give a summative grade as well. And often the system they say will do that is what you just talked about. It's a rubric, and often it's a teacher designed rubric. And the problem is, it's like a lot of systems where you want to try and do everything, it ends up doing nothing. It is good at neither. And I literally have like a whole chapter on why this system does not work either formatively or summatively. So, if you want the full chapter and verse and all the citations, go and read it. I'll give you the kind of brief summary now. That system, that rubric-based system, it doesn't matter who's designed the rubric. Like when I started out as a young teacher, I thought there was like we had exam boards here, big exam boards, and I thought there would be some magic room in the exam board with a rubric factory, and that's where you design a rubric that will work. But no, there is no, there is no room like that. So it doesn't matter who's designing the rubric and how well they're crafting the language on it, right? That system will not give you the precision you need to create the shared summative meaning. And we can prove that empirically. We can prove that with data, right? Because we can get, as I said at the start, we can get a bunch of 100 teachers to make an assessment using that rubric. Take one teacher and we'll get them to make 100 assessments using that rubric, assessments of 100 different students. And then we'll get another teacher to come in and to assess the same 100 students using the same rubric. And then we add in all teachers and we see what they do. And I promise you, they won't agree, right? They won't agree even when they're judging something relatively standardized that students produce, like a piece of writing. They definitely won't agree if they're making judgments on how well they share, right? So, and then, the issue, as I said, I'm going to repeat this because it's really important, because when I explain that first bit to people, they'll go, okay, yeah, people generally accept that. Okay, we're not going to agree with each other. But deep down, I talk to people and I know deep down they're thinking, I'm right and they're all wrong. People are thinking, I'm using the rubric correctly. If only everybody would agree with me, it would all work. Well, no, because it's worse than that, because you are not going to agree with yourself. Okay, that's how bad it is, right? And again, we can prove this empirically. So let's go back to that teacher with those 100 students, judging those 100 students using the rubric. You then come back a week later and you say, okay, you need to judge another 100 students. And what you don't tell them is like six of them are the same. Do they give those six students the same mark they gave them the first time? So there've been lots of studies done on that with student writing, and they don't. And if you're being honest with yourself, if you've done any form of assessment, you will know that you do differ and you do not have perfect reliability. And this is not an issue. I'm always at pains to say at this point, this is not an issue with teachers being lazy or not being trained well enough or the rubric not being good enough. This is an issue with humans. We cannot do this kind of thing. So what I find incredibly frustrating is the number of systems that are forcing teachers to do stuff that humans cannot do. It's a colossal waste of time. So that's your first problem. You're never going to get that level of agreement to get the kind of summative data that you want. So then people say, okay, all right, maybe this system doesn't work for summative assessment. They say, well, maybe it works for formative assessment. Maybe isn't it useful to say to the kid, well, you need to work on your group work. You need to do this or that. And again, my response to this is these rubrics and this kind of language, this is not useful for formative feedback because it is not specific and precise enough. And Dylan William has some fantastic bits on this. So Dylan William talks about going to a school in the US, a middle school, and he asks a student in a science lesson about the feedback they've been given. And the feedback is on a project-based scientific inquiry project that they've done. And the feedback is you need to make your scientific inquiries more systematic. And Dylan Williams says to the student, what does that mean to you? Like, what are you going to do differently as a result? And the student says, I don't know. If I knew how to be more systematic, I would have been so the first time. So that is a very flippant kind of throwaway phrase. You might think that's a student being a bit cheeky. But when I read that for the first time, I cringed because I was an English teacher and I had spent hours of my Sunday evenings often writing out comments like that on students' essays. And what Dylan Williams is trying to say there is that kind of feedback that is taken from the rubric is not helpful. It might be true. That it probably is true that students' scientific investigation probably do need to be more systematic. The one I was always guilty of, you need to infer more insightfully. Yeah, my students did need to infer more insightfully. Is telling them that going to help them do it better? So Dylan Williams says it's true. This kind of feedback, he says it's true but useless. And he says it's like telling an unsuccessful comedian to, tell funnier jokes. What you actually have to do to help a student improve, to fulfill the formative next steps function of an assessment, is you have to give them something, an action step that they can do that is much more precise, that will help their thinking move on. And that is not easy. I'm not pretending that's easy. And that's why I think direct instruction is really good, because often it's setting out that chain for you. And I talk about it, I call it in my book, Making Good Progress, I call it a model of progression. What is the sort of step here? But the crucial thing I say in my book is you cannot define the model of progression in prose. It's not something that you can say, at this level, it's can create a scientific investigation that is a bit systematic, that is medium levels of systematic, that is very systematic. It doesn't work like that. You've got to break it right the way down. And so to give that example I talked about, can you infer more insightfully? When you actually break down what inference is and what it takes for a student to infer, actually what you realize is they need a lot of vocabulary. So you can have a lesson that doesn't look anything like inference, where you're teaching students, the meaning of some new words or some new prefixes and suffixes, but that is going to help them become better at inference, because you are giving them the vocabulary they need to be able to infer. So what I would be saying is that example you gave of people creating their own rubrics, using them to assess projects, I do not think that is possible of giving you reliable summative data or useful formative information.
And it's sort of like the idea that we can measure it, fine. Okay, so maybe everybody agrees you can't, after they hear this, okay, I can't actually measure it reliably. Okay, maybe I can't really give a summative judgment or a formative judgment. Okay, fine, 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 right? But they're like, but I like these projects. And this is where it all comes down to like, what am I measuring in the end? I'm measuring skills that I didn't that I believe are transferable and that I can teach. And when you do these rubrics, there's very rarely even a component that relates to what kind of factual knowledge that they learned during the previous teaching. So now I'm actually not even measuring the thing that I supposedly was supposed to have been teaching, which is maybe historical knowledge or scientific knowledge. I'm now just looking at the kind of the
Mhm.
aesthetics of a project. It's just kind of a mess. And maybe in the United States had more discussion on the skills versus knowledge kind of debates would maybe help people understand that that they're not even measuring oftentimes what they were supposed to be teaching.
Yeah, so what I find so fascinating about this, and what is just so interesting, is what you've just talked about of people using very generic prose descriptors to assess a purported kind of transferable skill and forgetting about any of whatever the actual content was of that project. This is it is a global universal. Like I see it in so many different countries, so many different jurisdictions. And that's why, like, at its fundamental root, it is the root of it is an error of the understanding of the relationship between knowledge and skills. And what is so interesting about seeing it in so many different countries and jurisdictions is it's nothing to do with like the specific policy issues of a country, or the specific kind of system or curriculum or whatever that they have. At root, it is a fundamental issue about the misunderstanding of the relationship with knowledge and skills, because you see it everywhere. And if you want, again, if you've got some show notes or anything, or you want to send out some links with this, I actually wrote this up on my Substack about 18 months ago. It's one of the most popular articles on our Substack. And I wrote about it in a discussion of Scotland's education, because Scotland really kind of went in for this very kind of project-based approach to curriculum and assessment. And they have kind of mandated a form of assessment that is really, really similar to what you have been talking about. And as I say, I see this kind of thing pop up in so many different places. And the issue I say is, where you see this pop up, this is the biggest issue. And why it's the biggest issue is, let's go back to, as you say, what you need to understand is the skills and knowledge debate to make sense of this and to understand why it's an issue, right? So people think the skills and knowledge debate is a pendulum. They think that there is skills at one end and knowledge at the other. Even people who are pro knowledge, often, they will think, oh, we need to teach a little bit of knowledge, but we can't forget the skills. The skills really matter too. Let's make sure we don't neglect them. They conceptualize it, as I say, as a pendulum, sort of going back and forward. And I remember once, a TV producer saying to me, maybe we could have half the lesson on knowledge and half on skills. And my point is, that is entirely the wrong way of thinking about it. The actual relationship between knowledge and skills is that knowledge, that's the kind of component building blocks, and the skills are kind of the end goal, when you put all the building blocks together and you get the house. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about it as being a pendulum. You have to conceptualize it as a pathway. A skill being maybe a kind of really sophisticated, powerful bodies of knowledge that are really well committed to memory. That might be the best way of thinking about what a skill is. And let me give you an example. We said at the start examples. This is all a bit abstract. Reading, inference is your classic example of this. Because what do you need to be able to understand when you read? To be able to make those inferences and to do all those higher order reading skills, like reading between the lines and seeking out the deeper meaning, you have to know what the words mean. And you have to have background knowledge about the implied information that the author's leaving out, that they just assume that you know. So something like inference is not this muscle that you can practice in the abstract. It is really dependent on content knowledge, and that is true of every skill. So this whole concept of transferable skills, that you can just you can have it in one domain and you can easily then have it in another, there's just no basis for them. And one of my favorite papers on this issue is called "Could Steven Spielberg Manage the Yankees?" Right? And the idea is, Steven Spielberg is a very creative filmmaker. He's very good at that. Could he transfer that creativity over to being successful in a completely different field? Well, probably not, because the skills you have, that they're embedded in this domain knowledge. And another one, my other jokey example is, you've got an amazing physicist. They're very good at problem solving within the domain of physics. They're maybe not so good at problem solving within the realm of a marital problem, right? Like, you can't just transfer. It's not this generic thing you pick up and you apply across the board. And so this is when we are getting assessments that are essentially saying things about generic applications of critical thinking or communication or problem solving. Those assessments and those rubrics are the practical endpoints of a fundamental misunderstanding about the relationship of knowledge and skills. And the fact that I see them again and again pop up across the world tells me that this misunderstanding is everywhere. And you can't fix this. There isn't a kind of practical fix to this where you can just slap on a plaster. And I wish there was. The only way you can fix this is to go right back to the root misunderstanding and try and unpick it. You've just got to start there. And you could read my book, Making Good Progress. It's a good place to start. So I lay all of this out. Does that resonate with your kind of experience? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's actually a pretty complex argument.
Yeah.
It's hard to convey that information because the assumptions are all wrong when you're talking to this
Yeah.
person, right?
Yeah.
You're in with a principal and
Mm.
she's seen this project taking place. Number one, she's happy about how it looks. It matches her values. But then she says to you, I just wish the teacher was doing more with trying to, maybe build a rubric around this, maybe looking a little bit more like a scientist, sort of being a detective, right? I wish can you help her create a rubric for this? And, that sort of outlines the things that she's looking for. And it's like, I've got to back all the way up
I
to
know. I
something
know.
that is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Yeah.
way beyond what you're asking me.
Hmm. No, absolutely. And I would say, I've seen this again and again myself. And this is why I'm saying it's something that is so hard to unpick because you have to go right back to some sort of fundamentals. There's a really good guy, it was a reading specialist in the UK, Christopher Such, and he says the most common question that he gets asked when he visits a school is, what should our school put on its reading progression documents? And he says they want statements like, be able to infer characters' emotions from explicit details in the text, be able to infer characters' emotions from implicit references in the text. And he's got a fantastic blog where he explains like why this is a problem. And I remember this when I started teaching, because you can be, again, the issue with skills being domain specific, even within a subject, when you're starting out to learn in a subject, you can be fantastic at making inference about one text that you know a lot about, and you can be not so good at another text that you really know very little about. So even kind of within that, you can really be good in one way and struggle in another. Anything like that would not even be stable, even if it were possible to kind of get one sort of reliable reading using a rubric like that. We all come up against it. Chris will be visiting schools and he'll be seeing this. I see it all the time. And it's essentially, as I say, it's because it's an entire kind of worldview, and it is very hard to unpick.
Daisy, we have talked about a whole load of different ideas around assessment, and I'm always trying to be able to give people solutions to problems. And so I'd love for you to maybe sort of close us out with where to find you and how to, perhaps boost assessment in writing. How can they kind of get in contact with you and learn more about your stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on social media. I'm on X. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me there. We've got a Substack where we do lots of updates. We update people very frequently on that, and we try to be globally focused. We're kind of, our Substack audience is 50% UK, 50% international. If you want to find out more about comparative judgment specifically, we do a website, nomoremarking.com. So the name of the organization I work for is No More Marking. We will solve this problem of attempting to assess open tasks reliably. So I've talked a lot about the difficulty of assessing tasks with rubrics, but those tasks that you think are really hard to assess, if you want to assess them with comparative judgment, amazing. You can assess writing really reliably using teacher assessment and not have all the issues of unreliability and disagreement that I talked about. So it's a really great solution, and we work with quite a few schools in the US. So if you're a US school and you want to work with us, have a look at our website. We've got a US project, and we've had one for a few years now.
Perfect. Daisy Christodoulou, thank you so much for coming on the show. Listeners, thank you again for tuning in to Progressively Incorrect, a show that I try to post every week. So happy to have everybody tuning in once again. Share it with a principal, share it with a friend, give it a 5-star rating on the podcast platform of your choosing. Daisy, thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, Zach. Cheers. Thank you.